Get away from that window right now. You don't belong on this floor, the charge nurse snarled at 17-year-old Jamal Davis, her voice cutting through the sterile corridor of Manhattan's Lenox Hill Hospital with a venom that had been perfected over years of enforcing invisible hierarchies, her finger jabbing toward the VIP suite behind her, where America's third richest man lay dying behind reinforced glass. Marcus Whitmore is worth $12 billion, and some janitor's son has absolutely no business standing here gawking at him, like he's some kind of zoo exhibit. So take your mop cart and get back down to the basement where you actually belong. Before Jamal could form words to explain what he'd seen, she ripped the worn medical journal from his trembling hands and hurled it down the corridor with enough force that pages exploded across the polished marble floor like dying birds, the sound echoing off walls that had witnessed 1,000 small cruelties just like this one. Through the window behind the nurse's rigid shoulders, Marcus Whitmore's body was seizing violently on the hospital bed, his 72-year-old frame arching impossibly against the restraints, while his skin had turned the color of wet concrete and his lips darkened to a disturbing shade of purple-black that Jamal recognized with absolute certainty. The cardiac monitor was screaming in chaotic patterns that 15 of Manhattan's most elite physicians couldn't decipher, creating a cacophony of alarms that spoke of imminent death. And despite every intervention they'd attempted in the past 40 minutes, despite every medication they'd pushed through his IV lines, despite decades of combined medical expertise, none of them had any idea what was systematically killing one of the most powerful men in American technology, a man whose survival could mean millions in hospital donations, and whose death would almost certainly end multiple medical careers. Except for the black teenager in a janitor's uniform whom they'd just dismissed like rubbish. The same boy who had been desperately trying to tell them exactly what was wrong and exactly how to save him before it was too late. 47 minutes earlier, Jamal had been in the basement maintenance room that perpetually smelled of industrial cleaner and burnt coffee, a space so far removed from the wealth and privilege 12 floors above that it might as well have existed in a different country entirely. And he'd been reading a case study from the New England Journal of Medicine that he'd rescued from a research department rubbish bin 3 weeks ago, the pages worn soft from constant rereading, because this particular article about torsade de pointe and magnesium deficiency had burned itself into his memory with the intensity of trauma. His father Gerald sat hunched over the bank of security monitors, watching dozens of screens that showed every corner of the hospital's vast complex, his night shift nearly over, his exhaustion evident in the slope of his shoulders and the way he rubbed his eyes every few minutes. "Dad, something's wrong upstairs," Jamal said suddenly, his voice tight with a certainty that made Gerald look up immediately, because he'd learned over 17 years that when his son spoke with that particular tone, he was never, ever wrong about what he sensed. "What do you mean, son? What are you picking up?" Gerald asked, already moving towards Jamal's position near the ventilation grate. "There's a chemical smell coming through the air system from the 12th floor, specifically from the VIP wing," Jamal explained, his hands beginning to shake in that particular way they did when his heightened senses detected something fundamentally wrong with the world around him, something that other people couldn't perceive. "It's the same smell that came from Mom's hospital room in the weeks before she died, that sweet but wrong scent, like fruit rotting from the inside out, and I know exactly what it means." Gerald felt his stomach drop because 3 years ago, his wife Maya had died screaming on the 8th floor of this very hospital, misdiagnosed 4 separate times over 2 agonizing weeks, sent home repeatedly by doctors who'd written anxiety and drug-seeking behavior in her medical charts, dismissed and diminished until she'd finally collapsed in their bathroom at 3 a.m. and died in the ambulance before they could even get her back to the hospital. And the autopsy weeks later had revealed acute intermittent porphyria, a disease so rare that most physicians encountered it perhaps once in an entire career, if ever. And a simple 50-pound urine test could have saved her life if anyone had bothered to listen to what she'd been trying to tell them. Jamal had been 14 years old when he'd watched his mother die, had held her hand during those final terrible hours when the seizures had taken her, had listened to her screaming in pain that doctors insisted was psychosomatic. And in the 3 years since her death, he had transformed his grief into obsessive study, teaching himself medicine from journals he found in hospital rubbish bins, from textbooks that researchers had discarded, from case studies that had been thrown away as outdated. And he'd memorized every symptom, every diagnostic criterion, every treatment protocol for the disease that had killed her, driven by a promise he'd whispered at her grave. Never again. Never would he let someone die like that if he had the knowledge to prevent it. "Are you absolutely certain about what you're smelling?" Gerald asked, though he already knew the answer because Jamal's sensory processing was different from neurotypical people, heightened in ways that made crowded spaces overwhelming, but also allowed him to detect patterns and changes that others missed entirely. "I'm certain, Dad, and whoever's up there is going to die in the next hour if someone doesn't recognize what's happening and administer the correct treatment," Jamal said, standing abruptly and heading toward the service elevator, his notebook clutched against his chest like armor. "They'll be giving him the wrong medications, probably barbiturates for the seizures, which will actually accelerate the porphyrin cascade and kill him faster, and I need to tell them to stop before it's too late." Gerald grabbed his security access card and followed his son into the elevator, knowing this would likely cost him his job, but unable to ignore the desperate certainty in Jamal's voice. Unable to forget how many times doctors had dismissed Maya's symptoms until it was too late. Unable to live with himself if they stood by and let someone else die when Jamal's extraordinary mind had identified exactly what was wrong. The elevator climbed with agonizing slowness, each floor marker another reminder of precious seconds slipping away. And Jamal's breathing was coming too fast, his hands tapping against his thighs in the stimming pattern that helped him manage overwhelming anxiety, the fluorescent lights overhead far too bright for his sensitive eyes. When the doors finally opened on the 12th floor, they found themselves facing Dr. Richard Hayes, the senior attending physician whose gray hair and expensive glasses spoke of decades of authority and prestige, and Gerald recognized him immediately with the sick feeling in his gut, because this was the same doctor who had written drug-seeking behavior in Maya's chart, the same man who had sent her home to die because he'd been too arrogant to consider that a hospital janitor might actually be experiencing a real medical emergency rather than manipulating the system for prescription drugs. "Turner, what are you doing on the VIP floor?" Hayes demanded, his voice carrying the kind of casual contempt that came from a lifetime of believing some people were simply worth more than others, his eyes flicking dismissively over Gerald's security uniform. "Your badge isn't authorized for this level, and you certainly have no business bringing your son up here during a medical emergency." "My son knows what's wrong with your patient, Dr. Hayes," Gerald said, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the rage building in his chest at the sight of the man who'd let his wife die. "He can tell you exactly what's killing Marcus Whitmore and exactly how to save him, but you need to listen to him right now before you make the same mistake you made with my wife 3 years ago." Hayes' expression shifted slightly, some flicker of recognition crossing his features before settling back into professional dismissal. "Your son is 17 years old and dropped out of school 2 years ago, according to hospital records. And you're suggesting he knows something that 15 board-certified physicians with over 200 years of combined experience don't know? That's absolutely absurd, Turner. And I'm going to have to ask you both to leave immediately before I call actual security to remove you forcibly." Through the gap beside Hayes' rigid form, Jamal could see directly into the VIP suite, where Marcus Whitmore's body was convulsing with increasing violence, the monitors screaming their various alarms. And he counted 7 different doctors surrounding the bed in escalating panic, their faces showing the kind of fear that only comes when expertise fails and death approaches despite every intervention. "That's Torsade de Pointe on the monitor," Jamal said quietly, his eyes fixed on the distinctive twisted pattern of the heart rhythm visible through the window. "And you're about to shock him with the defibrillator, which will kill him if you don't administer intravenous magnesium sulfate first to correct the underlying electrolyte imbalance that's causing the arrhythmia. And I know you're also giving him barbiturates for the seizures, which means you're actively making his condition worse with every dose, because barbiturates are porphyrinogenic drugs that trigger the enzyme deficiency cascade." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Hayes stared at this teenager in worn trainers and a faded hoodie who had just used terminology that no dropout should possess, who had identified a specific cardiac rhythm from 12 meters away, who had somehow diagnosed the exact medications they were administering behind closed doors. "How could you possibly know what medications we're using?" Hayes demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "I can see the IV bags from here, and I can read the labels because my vision is different from yours, more acute in some ways. And I can see the phenobarbital solution in the drip chamber. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that every milligram you give him is pushing him closer to irreversible cardiac arrest," Jamal explained, his voice remaining flat and clinical, even as his hands shook with the effort of maintaining composure. "He has acute intermittent porphyria, exactly the same disease that killed my mother in this hospital 3 years ago, while you told her the pain was all in her head, Dr. Hayes. While you sent her home 4 times to die because you couldn't be bothered to order a simple urine test that would have shown porphobilinogen in her system." The color drained from Hayes' face as memory crashed over him. Fragments of a case he'd tried to forget. A woman who'd kept returning to the emergency department, insistent and desperate, whom he'd dismissed as drug-seeking, and he remembered signing the discharge papers that final time. Remembered thinking she was being manipulative and dramatic. Remembered his irritation at her for wasting his valuable time. "I see hundreds of patients every month. I can't possibly remember every individual case," Hayes began, but Jamal cut him off, with a voice that had gone absolutely cold. "Maya Davis, employee number 4126, janitor in the research wing, 34 years old when she died on our bathroom floor at 3:17 a.m. on September 22nd, 3 years ago, 18 hours after you sent her home for the 4th time, telling her the pain was anxiety and she needed to see a psychiatrist instead of wasting emergency department resources," Jamal recited with perfect accuracy, and then he pulled a folded document from his pocket, worn soft from years of handling. "And this is why she died. This is why you didn't recognize her disease, because the research that would have taught doctors like you how to identify and treat porphyria was terminated 8 years ago by the man who's dying in that room right now." He unfolded the paper with trembling hands, revealing a Whitmore Technologies internal memorandum, dated March 15th, 2017, the company logo clearly visible at the top, and Hayes took it with hands that had started shaking. The document detailed a proposed research program for porphyria treatments, £8.5 million over 5 years, that could have saved approximately 2,000 lives globally, and established diagnostic protocols that would have entered medical school curricula. But at the bottom, in Marcus Whitmore's own signature, were the words that had sealed its fate: project terminated, patient population insufficient, return on investment negative, recommend reallocating funds to more profitable research areas. "I found this in a rubbish bin on the 3rd floor research wing 8 years ago," Jamal said quietly, along with the 11 other similar memos, 12 different rare diseases that Whitmore Technologies decided weren't worth studying because the patient populations were too small to generate acceptable profits for shareholders. And my mother died because one of those diseases wasn't considered financially valuable enough to research. And now the man who made that decision is dying of another disease on that same list. And you're asking me why I'm here." A desperate shout came from inside the suite, cutting through their confrontation. "He's crashing, heart rate dropping below 40. Someone get the crash trolley in here immediately." The monitors were shrieking even louder, the unmistakable sound of death approaching with terrible speed. And Hayes looked at the memo in his hands, at the dying billionaire visible through the window, at the teenage boy who had somehow diagnosed what 15 elite physicians had missed. "If you're wrong about this, if we follow your advice and he dies, I'll lose my medical license," Hayes said, but his voice had lost its earlier contempt, replaced by something that might have been humility or might just have been fear. "I'm not wrong, and you don't have time to debate this," Jamal said, already moving past Hayes toward the door. "I've studied porphyria every single day for 3 years. I know every symptom, every diagnostic criterion, every treatment protocol better than anyone in that room. Because they learned about it once in medical school and then forgot it existed, but I learned it by watching my mother scream in agony while doctors told her she was imagining things. So you can either listen to me now, or you can explain to the media tomorrow why Marcus Whitmore died, because you were too proud to accept help from a janitor's son." Hayes made his decision in that moment, pushing open the door to the VIP suite, and every head turned as Jamal walked into a room full of doctors who had spent their entire careers learning to ignore people exactly like him. Dr. Catherine Reynolds stood closest to the bed, defibrillator paddles in her hands, preparing to shock Marcus's failing heart, and she looked at this teenage intruder with an expression that mixed confusion and outrage. "Who authorized a child to be in here during a code?" she demanded. But Hayes stepped forward with newfound conviction. "The boy knows the diagnosis when none of us could identify it, and unless someone has a better explanation for why this patient is dying, despite every intervention we've attempted, I suggest we listen to what he has to say." Nervous laughter rippled through the room, dismissive and uncomfortable, and Dr. James Cooper, a cardiologist with 30 years of experience, didn't bother hiding his contempt. "We have 15 physicians in this room with a combined 200 years of training, and you're seriously suggesting we take medical advice from someone who isn't even old enough to vote? I'm suggesting you stop the phenobarbital infusion immediately before you kill him," Jamal said, walking directly to the bedside without asking permission, his eyes scanning every detail with systematic intensity. "And I'm suggesting you administer 2 grams of intravenous magnesium sulfate right now, followed by hematin at 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, because those are the only treatments that can reverse a porphyric crisis once the cascade has begun. And if you shock his heart without first correcting the underlying metabolic derangement, you'll push him into ventricular fibrillation, and he'll be dead in 90 seconds. The room went absolutely silent, except for the screaming monitors and Marcus's labored breathing. And Reynolds stared at this boy who had just demonstrated knowledge that suggested an understanding of cardiac pathophysiology that rivaled her own. "That's an extraordinarily specific treatment protocol for an extraordinarily rare disease," she said carefully. "How do you know this?" "Because I watched my mother die of acute intermittent porphyria 3 years ago in this hospital, after being misdiagnosed 4 times, and I promised myself at her funeral that I would never let anyone else die like that, if I had the knowledge to prevent it," Jamal explained, his voice cracking slightly. "Look at his urine in the catheter bag. It's port wine colored, not blood tinged, but actual porphobilinogen accumulation. And if you have an ultraviolet lamp, shine it on the bag, and you'll see it fluoresce bright pink, which is pathognomonic for porphyria, absolutely diagnostic." Gerald, who had been standing in the doorway, pulled the UV torch from his security belt and handed it to Reynolds, and she looked at Hayes with a question in her eyes. "Do it," Hayes said quietly. "We've got nothing to lose at this point." Someone killed the overhead lights, and the room plunged into darkness except for the glow of the monitors. And when Reynolds held the UV torch against the catheter bag, the urine inside exploded into brilliant fluorescent pink, glowing like something radioactive. And every doctor in the room gasped audibly because they'd just seen definitive proof that this 17-year-old dropout had diagnosed something they'd completely missed. "Stop the barbiturates now. Hang the magnesium sulfate immediately, and someone call down to pharmacy for hematin," Reynolds ordered, her earlier dismissiveness completely gone. "How fast do we push the magnesium?" "IV push over 90 seconds, Jamal said, "and the hematin needs to be diluted in normal saline, 313 milligrams per vial. You should have 6 vials in stock, because you run a transplant program, and hematin is stocked for perioperative porphyria prophylaxis." A nurse was already on the phone to pharmacy, and she looked up in shock. "He's right. We have 6 vials in stock. How did he know that?" "Because I've memorized the formulary for every hospital in Manhattan," Jamal said simply, watching as they prepared the magnesium infusion. "And because I've spent 3 years making absolutely certain I know everything about this disease, so that I'd recognize it immediately if I ever encountered it again." The magnesium sulfate flowed into Marcus's bloodstream, and the room waited with the tense anticipation of professionals who had just deviated from standard protocols based on the advice of a teenager who, by all conventional measures, shouldn't know anything at all. 30 seconds passed, then 60, then 90, and gradually, impossibly, the twisted, chaotic pattern on the cardiac monitor began to smooth out, the torsade's rhythm stabilizing into something more regular and sustainable, and color started returning to Marcus's lips as his heart began pumping blood effectively again. "His heart rate is coming up 85 and holding steady," Reynolds announced, unable to keep the amazement from her voice. Seizure activity is decreasing. He's genuinely stabilizing. The hematon arrived and they hung the infusion. And over the next 10 minutes, Marcus Whitmore pulled back from the edge of death, his vital signs normalizing, his breathing evening out, his body finally relaxing as the porphyric crisis reversed under the correct treatment. And 15 doctors stood in stunned silence, processing the fact that a 17-year-old janitor's son had just demonstrated better diagnostic instincts than their combined centuries of medical training. Hayes turned to Jamal, who was now trembling violently as the adrenaline drained from his system, and asked the question everyone was thinking. How did you learn all of this? I taught myself from medical journals I found in hospital rubbish bins, Jamal said quietly, his eyes fixed on Marcus's face, watching the man whose decision had killed his mother's chance at diagnosis and treatment. I read everything I could find about porphyria and 11 other rare diseases that Whitmore Technologies decided weren't worth researching. And I memorized every case study, every treatment protocol, every diagnostic criterion, because I knew that if I ever encountered one of these diseases again, I would recognize it immediately, and maybe I could save someone the way nobody saved my mother. He looked at the memo that was still clutched in Hayes' hand, at Marcus Whitmore's signature that had terminated research 8 years ago. The man lying in that bed personally killed the research program that would have taught you how to recognize what killed my mother, Jamal continued, his voice absolutely flat. He buried it because the patient population wasn't large enough to generate acceptable returns for his investors. And she died invisible and forgotten because he decided her life wasn't financially valuable enough to study. And I've spent 3 years wanting someone to pay for that decision, wanting someone to understand what it cost. The room was absolutely silent now, everyone processing the moral complexity of what had just happened, the terrible irony that the boy whose mother had died because of Whitmore's financial calculation had just saved Whitmore's life despite having every reason to walk away. So why did you save him? Reynolds asked softly. Why didn't you just let him die? Jamal was quiet for a long moment before answering, his hands still shaking. Because my mother taught me that every life has value, even his. Even the lives of people who don't see that value in others. And she would have wanted me to save him, not because he deserved it, but because letting him die wouldn't have brought her back. It would just make me like him. Someone who decides which lives are worth saving based on their perceived value to society. And I promised myself I would never be that person. 2 hours later, Marcus Whitmore's eyes opened slowly, blinking against the harsh lights, confused and disoriented, and Reynolds leaned over him gently. Mr. Whitmore, you're at Lenox Hill Hospital. You experienced a severe porphyric crisis, but you're stable now. Memory returned in fragments. The gala, champagne, sudden tearing pain, then drowning in darkness. What happened to me? His voice was rough and painful. You have acute intermittent porphyria, an extremely rare genetic disorder, Reynolds explained. You nearly died, Mr. Whitmore, and you would have died if not for an extraordinary intervention. Whitmore's eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in the 15 physicians who represented the absolute best his money could buy. And then his gaze landed on someone completely unexpected, a teenage black boy in a worn hoodie and faded jeans, standing beside a man in a security guard uniform. Who are they and why are they in my room? He asked with confusion. That's Jamal Davis and his father Gerald, Reynolds said carefully. Gerald worked security here on the night shift, and Jamal diagnosed your condition when none of us could identify it. Whitmore stared in disbelief. That's a child. He can't be more than 17 years old. He's 17, dropped out of school 2 years ago, and taught himself medicine from textbooks and journals he found in hospital rubbish bins, Reynolds explained. He saved your life tonight, when 15 of the best physicians in Manhattan couldn't figure out what was killing you, Mr. Whitmore, and he did it despite having every reason in the world to let you die. She handed him the worn memo that Jamal had been carrying, and Whitmore unfolded it with shaking hands, his face going white as recognition crashed over him. Whitmore Technologies letterhead, March 15th, 2017, the Porphyria Research Proposal, £8.5 million over 5 years, his own signature at the bottom sealing its termination. Where did you get this? He whispered. From a rubbish bin 8 years ago, Jamal said quietly from across the room. Someone threw away all the terminated project files, and I kept them, all 12 memos, 12 different rare diseases that your company decided weren't profitable enough to research. Whitmore looked at this boy, really seeing him for the first time, and asked the question that was tearing him apart. Why would you save me after what I did? Jamal took a shaky breath before answering. My mother died of porphyria 3 years ago because doctors didn't recognize it, because it wasn't taught properly in medical schools, because your company terminated the research that would have established diagnostic protocols and treatment guidelines. And I've spent every day since then studying these diseases, learning everything I could, promising myself that I would never let anyone else die like that if I had the knowledge to prevent it. His voice cracked with emotion he could no longer contain. I didn't save you because you deserved it, Mr. Whitmore. I saved you because my mother would have wanted me to. Because she taught me that every life has value regardless of what that person has done. And because letting you die wouldn't have brought her back, or changed anything except making me into someone she wouldn't have recognized. Someone who calculates the worth of human lives the way you calculated that research programs weren't financially viable. The words hit Whitmore like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy, and he stared at his own signature from 8 years ago, at the decision he'd made without ever considering the human cost, at the memo that represented someone's mother who had died because he'd prioritized return on investment over human lives. What was her name? He asked quietly. Maya Davis, employee number 4126. She cleaned floors in your research wing, Jamal said. She was 34 years old. She loved reading mystery novels. She made the best Sunday roasts in our neighborhood. And she died screaming in agony on our bathroom floor, whilst doctors told her the pain was all in her head, because nobody knew how to recognize the disease that you decided wasn't worth studying. At 4:30 in the morning, Marcus Whitmore sat up in his hospital bed, still weak but with his mind completely clear, and he looked at the memo again, at his signature, at the boy who had saved him despite everything. I need my phone immediately, he said with sudden urgency. Mr. Whitmore, it's 4:30 in the morning, Reynolds protested. I don't care what time it is. Give me my phone now, Whitmore ordered, and when they handed it to him, he began making calls, his voice growing stronger with each conversation. Wake up every member of my board of directors. Emergency meeting at 8 a.m. Attendance is mandatory. I don't care that it's Sunday morning, he said into the phone. And then he called his legal team. I need 3 documents drafted immediately. First, establishment of the Maya Davis Rare Disease Research Fund. £50 million annually, in perpetuity with no return on investment requirements whatsoever. Pure research into diseases that pharmaceutical companies ignore because patient populations are too small to be profitable. Second, the Jamal Davis Medical Scholarship Program. Full funding for students who learn differently, students with autism, dyslexia, ADHD, students the traditional educational system has failed, but who possess extraordinary pattern recognition abilities. And third, complete transparency in all research termination decisions. Every canceled project will be made public with full justification. No more buried research, no more forgotten patients. He looked directly at Jamal with something approaching reverence. If this boy could forgive me enough to save my life when he had every reason to let me die, then I can spend the rest of mine making absolutely certain that no one else dies because I was too blind to see their value. And I want him involved in designing these programs because he understands what's actually needed better than any consultant I could possibly hire. Hayes stepped forward with sudden inspiration. Mr. Whitmore, Jamal needs more than just a scholarship. He needs a role here, right now, today. We should create a rare disease diagnostic consultation service with Jamal as the lead consultant. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. He's 17 years old with no medical degree, no formal training whatsoever. This hospital, with all its expertise and resources, almost let a billionaire die tonight, Hayes countered sharply. A 17-year-old boy with notebooks full of discarded research saved him when 15 board-certified physicians couldn't identify what was killing him. So perhaps our traditional credentialing requirements need reconsideration. He looked at Jamal directly. You would work alongside us as a genuine colleague, not as some curiosity or token. We handle the legal aspects of patient care, whilst you provide the pattern recognition and diagnostic insight we clearly lack, a true partnership between different kinds of expertise. Jamal looked overwhelmed, his hands shaking. I can't possibly do that. I'm not qualified. You already did it tonight, Reynolds said gently. You identified a 1 in 100,000 disease in minutes when we were completely lost. You predicted the treatment complications before they occurred, and you know more about rare diseases than most specialists will learn in their entire careers. So yes, you are absolutely qualified. 6 months later, Lenox Hill Hospital had been transformed in ways that nobody could have predicted. The third-floor research wing, the area where Maya Davis had once cleaned floors and where Jamal had found those discarded memos 8 years ago, had been converted into the Rare Disease Diagnostic Center. And Jamal Davis sat at a desk surrounded by medical journals, case files, and computer monitors, streaming real-time data from a national database they'd built to track rare disease presentations. He was still 17, still wore hoodies to every meeting, still struggled with direct eye contact and got overwhelmed in crowded spaces. But he was also the chief diagnostic consultant, a title that carried genuine weight and authority. And in 6 months, he had successfully diagnosed 43 rare disease cases that would have been missed or misdiagnosed under traditional approaches. 43 patients who were alive because a janitor's son had taught himself medicine from rubbish bins and had the courage to speak up when everyone else would have stayed silent. The door opened and Reynolds entered with a young resident. Jamal, we need your insight on a challenging case. 26-year-old female with 6 months of progressive muscle weakness, particularly severe after exertion. Creatine kinase levels completely normal. EMG inconclusive. Jamal looked up from his current research. Exercise intolerance with normal CK? What other symptoms? Intermittent double vision, drooping eyelids that worsen by evening, all symptoms improve with rest, Reynolds listed. Jamal was already typing, pulling up the database that had grown from his original documentation to over 4,000 cases. Myasthenia gravis with atypical presentation. Run acetylcholine receptor antibody test immediately. If negative, then test for MuSK antibodies. Approximately 15% of MG patients are seronegative for HAR, but positive for MuSK, and get a chest CT to check for thymoma. Reynolds smiled with satisfaction. The resident already ordered HER, and it came back negative. Then order MuSK antibodies right away and the chest imaging, Jamal said. Also check her medication history for anything that could be exacerbating myasthenia. Certain antibiotics and beta blockers can worsen the condition significantly. After they left, Jamal returned to his work, developing comprehensive training modules for medical students, turning everything he'd taught himself into structured educational materials that would prevent future doctors from missing the diagnoses that had killed his mother and nearly killed Marcus Whitmore. His phone buzzed with a text from Gerald. Incredibly proud of you, son. See you at dinner tonight. 3 years later, at 20 years old, Jamal Davis became the youngest person ever awarded the Lasker Prize for Medical Innovation, recognizing his transformative contribution to rare disease diagnosis and his creation of a national database that had helped identify over 2,000 cases worldwide. The Maya Davis Rare Disease Research Fund had funded 63 different research projects. The Jamal Davis Medical Scholarship had supported 147 students who learned differently, and Marcus Whitmore had kept every promise he'd made that morning in his hospital bed, transforming his company's research priorities and establishing transparency protocols that other pharmaceutical companies had begun to adopt. At the awards ceremony, Jamal stood on stage wearing his signature hoodie under a blazer, still struggling with the bright lights and the crowd's attention. But when they asked him to say a few words, he just spoke with the same flat certainty he'd used that night in the VIP suite. My mother, Maya Davis, cleaned floors in hospitals and died because the medical system didn't value her life enough to properly diagnose her disease. And I'm standing here today, not because I'm exceptionally intelligent, but because I was angry enough and heartbroken enough to spend 3 years teaching myself everything that system had failed to teach the doctors who should have saved her, he said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. This award doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to every patient who has ever been dismissed or ignored. Every person whose disease was considered too rare to matter. Every life that was deemed insufficiently profitable to research. And my job now is to make absolutely certain that the medical system learns to see value in every patient, regardless of how common or profitable their condition might be. Because that's what my mother would have wanted, and because no one should have to save a billionaire's life to prove that their knowledge matters. The audience rose in standing ovation, but Jamal's eyes found his father in the front row and Marcus Whitmore sitting beside him, both men with tears streaming down their faces. And Jamal thought about that night 3 years ago, when he'd stood outside a VIP suite and made the choice to speak up despite every reason to stay silent. The night when a janitor's son had saved a billionaire's life, and in doing so had transformed not just his own future, but the future of thousands of patients whose lives had previously been invisible to a medical system that measured value and profit margins rather than human worth. And he knew with absolute certainty that his mother was watching from wherever she was now. Proud not because he'd become famous or won awards, but because he'd kept his promise to her. The promise that no one else would die the way she had died if he possessed the knowledge to prevent it. And that promise, more than any prize or recognition, was what made everything worthwhile.